Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of James Madison, and the focus is the Constitution. The year is 1787, it's May, and delegates are beginning to arrive for the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia at Independence Hall. In fact, Madison's the first to arrive. He's anxious to get going, he's the best prepared, and he is an active participant on almost every topic. In fact, he's there sitting in the front row right under George Washington, who was elected the president of the convention, and Madison was taking notes, which turned out to be pretty important because the delegates decided to hold the Constitutional Convention in secret so that there wouldn't be outside influence, people trying to get them to change their minds. They knew this was going to be controversial, so they closed the doors and they met in secret for 4 months. So Madison's detailed notes are one of the few records that actually emanated from the Constitutional Convention in terms of what happened and how it took place. Now, most of the folks who gathered together were leaning in the direction of a big change to the Articles of Confederation, the weak construct that was already in place that just wasn't working for a unified country to operate effectively. The question was, how far would they push that envelope? Now, one of the major constructs that had been in mode at the state level, but was not in place at the national level, was something actually based on writings of John Adams. Back in 1776, a treatise called Thoughts on Government that he wrote on behalf of some of the states were saying, well, look, we're an independent country now. What should my state constitution look like? And he advocated a three-branch system of government: a legislature, an executive, and a judiciary, and that legislature be bicameral, an upper and lower house, and you'd have checks and balances and sort of all of the above. Well, that was not the case under the Articles of Confederation. Almost none of that existed. It was a unicameral legislature only with one vote per state, no judiciary, no executive. And so and Madison included, were thinking along these lines of the document that Adams had produced the decade before. By the way, Adams isn't at the Constitutional Convention. As much as he would have liked to be, he's over in Europe right now representing his country as a diplomat. So Madison really got the ball rolling because he came prepared with something he called, or it was called, the Virginia Plan. And it was actually introduced by his Virginia colleague Edmund Randolph, and it had a number of key provisions really to generate a stronger national government. So here's some of the key parts of the Virginia Plan for Madison. Representation in the national legislature would be based proportionally on population in both houses of Congress. The lower house would be elected by the people. The upper house would be elected by the lower house based on nominations from the state legislatures. The upper house would then elect a national executive. Madison also put in a couple of constructs, one called the Council of Revision. He was worried about the legislature getting out of control, so he wanted to have this Council of Revision, including the executive and some members of the judiciary, as an additional check on the legislature. And finally, Madison was adamant about the need for a national veto over state laws, the ability for the national legislature to veto state laws. In fact, he said, let it have a negative in all cases whatsoever on the legislative acts of the states, as the King of Great Britain heretofore had. This I conceive to be essential and the least possible abridgment of the state sovereignties. Without such a defensive power, every positive power that can be given on paper will be unavailing. Now, for those that think of Madison in his future years, this is a really big change because right now what he's saying is anathema to the James Madison of the future, especially quoting the King of Great Britain and looking to replicate his power in the United States. Hard to imagine, but this is part of the odyssey of the political theories of James Madison. Nevertheless, one could ask the question, well, why didn't all this stuff, I don't recognize this stuff from the Constitution, because frankly, almost none of the Virginia Plan actually makes it into the Constitution. And this was a bit of a pattern for James Madison. So in these cases, for example, 4 times he introduced the Council of Revision, never got approved. On the national veto, he couldn't even get that assigned to a committee. That was really offensive to a lot of the states. A historian by the name of Forrest McDonald did a review of the Constitutional Convention notes, and he counted up 71 proposals that Madison either made, seconded, or strongly advocated for at the Constitutional Convention. 71. He lost 40 times. So he lost more than he got. it didn't stop him, and he continued to be an advocate over and over again, sometimes for the same issues, sometimes for new issues. He kept going despite a lot of these defeats. Now, Madison's Virginia plan did at least start the debate, and one of the principal areas they focused on initially was this idea of representation. Now, the small states weren't going to go for this idea of proportional representation in both houses of Congress, because then they would have very little power at the national legislature. So they countered in the opposite direction. William Paterson came up with the New Jersey plan, and that would be similar to the Articles of Confederation. A unicameral legislature, one state, one vote. Well, the large states weren't going to go for that. So they had their first major compromise, and it was Roger Sherman of Connecticut who introduced what became known as the Great Compromise, which is what we have today. Proportional representation for the states in the House, so the bigger states would have more people in the House of Representatives, but in the Senate it would be equal. The upper house, each state, would have 2 members. This was the Great Compromise. Now the question was, how do we determine population? And the key question was, would slaves count in terms of population count for representation? Again, very controversial, hot debates on both sides of the issues. Madison was less involved in this particular set of debates. He was, of course, a slaveholder, but he was also a member of the Enlightenment crowd of the Founding Fathers who abhorred slavery. And so he was in that camp along with Jefferson and many others who, thought it was a terrible thing, yet he couldn't divorce himself from the practice, didn't really know what to do with it from a political standpoint, but there were very strong opinions on the topic, and once again, they compromised. It was called the 3/5 Compromise. And it really meant that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person for 2 purposes. One, population for representation in the House of Representatives. Clearly, this is a boon for the South because it's going to inflate their numbers in the House. To counteract that, number 2 was that they would also count as 3/5 of a person for allocating requisitions of direct taxes to states. So it could actually cause them to have to pay higher taxes. The problem eventually resolved itself, though, for the South because the government rarely ever invoked this method of direct taxation against the states, and so the slave counts in that bucket never really mattered very much. And by some estimates, the South got about 30% more people than they would have had if slaves were not counted at all for representation in the House of Representatives, a 30% boost all the way to the Civil War. So the Great Compromise, or the compromise over the 3/5 Compromise, was really quite advantageous for the South. As for James Madison, he kind of shrugged his shoulders. He basically said, great as the evil is, slavery, a dismemberment of the Union would be worse. And he spoke for many of his colleagues at the Constitutional Convention who were clearly willing to compromise on this issue. In fact, there was another element in the Constitutional Convention where the word slavery or slave doesn't ever appear, but it's clearly sanctioned in the document, not only in the 3/5 Compromise, but also in the prohibition against canceling or impacting the international slave trade for at least 20 years. For folks like Madison, this was a compromise that was necessary to keep the Union together. Now they moved on to the judiciary, where this is the sort of the lightest level of debate and elements in the Constitution. They left a lot of that still for the future Congress to figure out what that construct would look like. But they did spend a lot of time on the national executive, in particular, how the president would be elected and what his tenure would be. Now, the Founding Fathers were actually very weary of direct election by the people. This idea of sort of mass democracy kind of scared them because they thought this was an uneducated masses. They would take control and actually use their power against the property class. These were some of the concerns that Madison and his colleagues had. So they came up with this idea of an electoral college. Electoral college meant that each state would be given one person for each member of Congress, House and Senate combined. So the larger states would have more members, because they were proportional in the House of Representatives, to vote for a president. The state legislatures would decide how to pick these electors. Either they would decide themselves, some gave it to popular vote, but mostly it was the state legislatures for many, many years until the popular vote became popular or more attractive across the states. Madison actually was fine with this because he didn't believe the Electoral College was actually going to elect many presidents, because he was more focused on what happens if nobody wins a majority in the Electoral College, because he thought that was going to happen most of the time. In fact, at one point he said 19 out of 20 times it's going to go to the tiebreaker, which the delegates decided to send to the House of Representatives, where each state would have one vote to decide the presidency. This is what Madison thought, because in his view, in a large republic, we'd have so many candidates representing so many interests from across so many states, the country wasn't going to unify in this electoral college around a single candidate. And of course, in this case, he was completely wrong. In fact, it's gone to the House of Representatives only a couple of times. And in fact, the two-party system that eventually developed, which is something that Madison really thought would never happen, he was a big instigator for when it finally came about. A couple of decades later. We'll talk about that in a future episode. The final change on the executive was going away from a single 7-year term to unlimited 4-year terms, re-elections possible. This is one of the things that Thomas Jefferson did not like about the Constitution. Now, Jefferson is also not there because he's serving as a minister in Europe as well. Jefferson thought this would lead to just a perpetual presidency for life, a kingly or monarchical kind of system. So this was one of his major concerns. His other concern was that there was no Bill of Rights, a set of rights that even a majority at the national level could not take away from the minority. They couldn't abuse their power in a certain level of rights. Well, Madison was among those who was against a Bill of Rights. In fact, really nobody at the Constitutional Convention was for it. They voted unanimously, 10-0 of those that voted, against having a Bill of Rights. And Madison's belief was really two reasons. One, he thought it was unnecessary. He saw the Constitution as a limited set of enumerated powers that the national government couldn't go beyond, and there was nothing in there that said they could take these rights away, so they don't have anything to worry about. The second was, if they started enumerating certain rights that were off limits, they would forget stuff or leave stuff out, and that would be dangerous because then those would be ripe for abuse. So Madison was among, again, the unanimous vote at the convention, no Bill of Rights at the Constitutional Convention. Final step was to write the document into a single form and get it signed. And Madison, Alexander Hamilton were part of the Committee of Style, but it was really Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania, another very active member of the Constitutional Convention, who got the pen to write this document into a single form. He took 23 articles and turned it into 7. He wrote that powerful preamble starting with "We the People." And in fact, Madison had a lot of praise for the talents and taste stamped by the author, Morris. A better choice could not have been made, as the performance of the task proved. Final thing was to vote and decide on it. And in fact, everybody voted in favor and put their name on the Constitution except 3 who had objections. But Madison was clearly one of those that was for it, even though he had concerns. He wasn't sure they really got it right. But he believed, like others, that this was the best they could do, far better than the Articles of Confederation, and they needed to move quickly to get it ratified, where 9 states were required to ratify to put the Constitution into effect. And Madison immediately pivoted to become a major player in the force for ratification, but that is the story for another day. And that is James Madison and the Constitution from the life of James Madison. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.